Recently, Oprah came out with an episode of her show/podcast on parent-child estrangement or going no contact. Unfortunately, particularly because of the way it was marketed as a trend and just the way she handled it in general, a lot of people were pretty upset with her.
I just saw Oprah's video about the no contact trend, and I have some very specific thoughts.
Oprah, it's not a trend, okay?
Hey everyone, I have been receiving so many DMs on Oprah's podcast today, and I know that it has stirred a lot of people up.
You know, my main takeaway from this whole Oprah thing is that we've been swallowing gruel, taking shit from our parents for so long, and our parents did it for so long that actually stepping away and healing looks like a trend.
Interestingly, I found out that estranged parents are also upset with her because they think she favored the adult children with the angle. Now, I watched the episode and I had a lot of thoughts, so I figured I would take you kind of frame by frame through the whole discussion and share what I thought about it. Because I think when you're dealing with such an important topic, you have to be really careful with how you frame it, or you could do more harm than good. And in my opinion, the way Oprah handled this left a lot to be desired. So let's get into it. Now, Oprah starts the show by explaining she's just kind of trying to understand what's happening here. It seems like she's sort of playing the middle ground.
I know this is a tender, hot button topic. My hope is that we can open up the heart space and really listen. I'm not on anybody's side. I just want to hear what everyone has to say.
And I gotta say, the angle that estrangement is a problem that needs to be tackled is a little bit strange to me, considering many children experience abuse at the hands of their parents. According to the World Health Organization, 6 in 10 children under 5 years of age regularly suffer physical punishment and/or psychological violence at the hands of parents and caregivers. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men report having been sexually abused as a child. Consequences of child maltreatment include impaired lifelong physical and mental health. Child maltreatment is often hidden, with only a fraction of victims of maltreatment getting support from health professionals. A child who's abused is more likely to abuse others as an adult, so that violence is passed down from one generation to the next. There's already a power imbalance between parents and children. For 18 years of their life, parents have absolute power over minors. After that too, it's not like a switch suddenly happens and, oh, now you're on equal footing. In a lot of situations, parents continue to treat their children like they are the ones whose say is final. And a lot of parents sort of struggle to gradually give their children more power and autonomy over their own lives. So questioning the validity of children's decision to cut off their parents is a risky endeavor, in my opinion, because we already know child abuse is extremely prevalent. We already know there's a power imbalance between parent and child. And the percentage of adult children who cut off their parents, it kind of depends on the source, but based on the stats I just gave you by the World Health Organization, more children are abused by their parents than are cutting off their parents. Also, I think people are just talking about it more loudly now because of social media and because of reduced stigma, but I'm not actually convinced that estrangement is more common now than it was in the past, and people who make these sort of claims don't often have evidence to back them up. I stopped to think about it and I was like, do I actually know anyone who's estranged from their parents? I thought, I have one friend who's estranged from her parent, but it's more that her parent just disappeared off the face of the earth. I know one person who's Gen X who's estranged from a parent. So nobody really in my generation, in my personal life, is estranged from a parent. And when I was working as a therapist too, in the first few years of working as a therapist, I was dealing with very underserved populations who were going through a lot. Dealing with parent-child conflict was honestly the least of their worries. But towards the end of my experience as a therapist working in college counseling, I had plenty of clients I can remember who had issues with their parents. But unless I'm forgetting something, I don't actually remember somebody who actually cut off their parent. Now, sure, this might be a selection bias. My experience is not necessarily representative of the general population, but I'm just saying, I have no anecdotal evidence that this is as rampant as we see online. And I think part of the issue with the way Oprah is going about this discussion is it's all fine and dandy to be neutral when dealing with a conflict between two people. But again, when we're dealing with a population where abuse allegations are so rampant, neutrality is not really cool in those situations. How would this look if this were a show where Oprah said, man, a lot of women are divorcing their husbands. I just want to get to the bottom of why that is, And then let's say some of the people she invites on the show are like, yeah, my husband abused me or whatever. And she's like, oh, did he? Like, how do you define that? That would be incredibly messed up, right? But there's this notion that like when it comes to someone you're related to by blood, that you have to have like a really, really good reason to cut them off, that it's somehow like a hate crime to cut off that person. But everyone has a right to end relationships no matter the reason. It's a basic human right. In some situations, even I might think, that's kind of a silly reason to cut someone off. But at the end of the day, I will never think that it's a problem. I will never frame it as a problem that somebody is choosing to remove themselves from a relationship, because that is just a basic human right. So after Oprah introduces the topic, she starts by introducing the experts she invited on the show. And she starts off with Dr. Josh Coleman, who I've actually heard of before because he's often cited by estranged parents. Now, Dr. Coleman has positioned himself as someone who facilitates healing between parents and children, who has been through estrangement himself, came out of it on the other side, and now has like this golden formula that parents can use. But the thing is, in my opinion, Dr. Coleman has violated the APA Code of Ethics in more than one way. There's a Reddit post that claims he reached out on behalf of an estranged parent, client of his, to an adult estranged child. And when I read that, I thought, that would be incredibly unethical. I should, actually verify this to make sure that I'm not like making a false allegation against this guy. Then I found a different Reddit post of someone saying that he also reached out to them and that this person actually met with him. This person says, he reached out to me a couple years ago at the request of my mother and asked for a Zoom call to discuss our estrangement. I hesitantly agreed to it, only with my therapist also on the call. In the email, he stated he'd only seen my mother once. On the call, he indicated only ever talking to her, never seeing her, and even after sharing my story and our history, tried to pressure me to have a conversation with her. Obviously, I did not appreciate this. I struggle with boundaries and it felt like he was exploiting this. My therapist and I had to basically both say no repeatedly before he finally gave up. I came away from the call frustrated and truly feeling like he is no expert in estrangement, but more in pressure and manipulation. Often a reason for estrangement. He was also super egotistical, would not recommend. So again, when I read this, I was like, oh my God, is this real? Did he actually do this? So I checked his website, which flat out states that he reaches out to adult children on behalf of his clients. Now, I'm not sure if I'm understanding this correctly. He charges $995 per 45-minute session. People are paying almost $1,000 for someone with the authority of a psychologist to reach out to their estranged child. Not to mention that one session is not enough time to assess if your client is actually abusive.
Uh-oh.
Though even after years of seeing them, I do not think this would be an appropriate thing to do. So let me just go through the different standards of the APA Ethics Code that this is violating. Standard 4.01 is all about maintaining confidentiality. When you have a client, you have a responsibility to maintain that client's confidentiality, including not confirming or disconfirming whether that person is your client. So basically, I would hope he has a sort of written consent form for all of his clients, giving him permission to reach out to these adult children, because otherwise he'd be admitting to treating someone, which would be a huge breach of confidentiality. Let's assume he does have a written consent for this. That is the bare minimum. Standard 10.01, informed consent to therapy. People need to provide informed consent to therapy. They need to understand what they are agreeing to it, and they need to do it willingly without any sort of coercion. Trying to essentially recruit someone into family therapy is the opposite of informed consent. It is beyond unethical to, in the first place, reach out to someone asking if they want to do therapy with you. It would never be appropriate for psychologists to, for instance, start emailing people asking them if they want to do therapy with them. That is not how therapists do marketing, not ethical ones at least. But that is on a whole different level when you realize that the people he's reaching out on behalf of, these kids have explicitly stated they want nothing to do with. Just a word of clarification, it would be okay for a therapist who's treating an individual to, for instance, say, hey, I think it might be helpful if we bring in this family member for a session or two. However, it would always need to come from the client themselves. It is not ethical or appropriate for the therapist to be reaching out to family members. A therapist should be very aware that this is a form of triangulation, which is where a third party gets involved sort of as a proxy to facilitate communication between two people. A third proxy who should not be involved in that relationship. Also, a decent therapist should be aware of the power and authority that a professional holds, and that can inadvertently coerce coerce people into something they might not otherwise want to do, such as participating in this therapy session. Standard 3.05 dual relationship says a multiple relationship occurs when a psychologist is in a professional role with a person and at the same time is in another role with the same person or someone closely associated with that person. So by contacting the estranged adult child, he's essentially entering into a non-therapeutic relationship with a third party because his client is still the parent, not the child, in order to serve the best interests of his client. This is a textbook example of a harmful multiple relationship. Standard 3.06 conflict of interest. Psychologists refrain from taking on a professional role when personal, scientific, professional, legal, financial, or other interests could impair objectivity, competence, or effectiveness. Therapists don't typically do family or couples therapy with someone once they've had individual therapy with them because it's impossible to remain objective. Dr. Coleman is essentially putting himself in a dual loyalty conflict. Will he serve the parent's agenda or the autonomy and well-being of their child? When it's just the parent that he's in contact with, it's clear-cut where his loyalty lies. But once someone else ends the therapeutic picture, his role shifts from individual therapy to family therapy, and his priority at that point needs to be the well-being of the family system rather than the individual who hired him. This is a direct conflict of interest. Not to mention, family therapy, couples therapy is not recommended with abusers. So straight up guaranteeing to your client that I'm going to facilitate some sort of family therapy between you and your adult child, when you know that there's a high likelihood that that person might have allegations of abuse against them, is a big no-no. And standard 3.04, avoiding harm. Psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their clients, students, research participants, organizational clients, and others. Reaching out to an estranged child where the likelihood is much higher that they experienced abuse at the hands of the person you're pressuring them into reconciling with has immense potential for emotional harm, especially when you've maybe only spoken to the client one time. So again, you really can't assess whether they're abusive or not. And especially when you're guaranteeing as part of a nearly $1,000 package that you're going to reach out to their adult child. So let's say that based on that one session that you have with that parent, you determine, oh yeah, they were probably abusive to their child because they straight up just admitted it. So are you then still going to reach out to their child for reconciliation, or are you going to give them a refund because you can't actually follow through on what you promised them? Also, it's not clear to me based on his website how much of it is therapy and how much of it is coaching. Sometimes therapists will be licensed in a state or multiple states, and if they have a large social media presence, they will also try to circumvent licensing jurisdiction by offering coaching to people in other states where they're not licensed. And this is actually riskier for licensed professionals than it is for unlicensed professionals, because as an unlicensed professional, you can call whatever coaching and offer it to people, and basically there's no governing body to hold you accountable. But when you're a licensed professional, there is a governing body to hold you accountable if you do something that's unethical. And basically what I was taught as part of a continued education course that I took on this, if it looks like therapy and it smells like therapy and it quacks like therapy, you're doing therapy, right? So it doesn't mean if you call it coaching or therapy, if you're practicing outside of your licensure and any reasonable person can look at that and be like, yeah, you're doing therapy, then that's not ethical because you're not licensed in that state. Specifically, what on his website Dr. Coleman calls coaching includes providing psychological assessment, like when he says he's diagnosing the problem, background questions that are pretty typical of what you might find in a therapy intake, family sessions in which the goal is relational reconciliation, and treatment planning when he says things like make recommendations about strategies. These typically fall under the domain of psychotherapy or counseling, which means that the practitioner must be licensed where the client is located. Labeling these things coaching doesn't change that. Anyway, that's a little bit of background on Dr. Coleman, but back to what he was actually saying in the introduction. I found it really interesting that in his introduction, Dr. Coleman claimed that therapists often call their clients' parents narcissist or borderline, sort of implying that therapists are pushing their adult children to go no contact by pathologizing these parents who they've never actually met.
Therapists are sort of green-lighting a lot of estrangements, particularly when you use language like, oh, your mom's a narcissist, or your dad's a borderline, or they're a sociopath, they're gaslighting you, or they're a boundary crosser. And once you say that to somebody, once you tell somebody that their parent or their family member or their child is that way, you just greenlit them cutting them off. Because now it's a virtuous act of protecting your mental health. I think that's a problem.
The reason I find this so interesting is because on his own website, Dr. Coleman says, as part of this $1,000 package, he will assess the role of mental illness or other challenges in your child as contributing factors to your estrangement, both when they were young and since entering adulthood. Assess the role of ADHD, learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, gender identity issues, and political differences as contributing factors to your estrangement, both when they were young and since entering adulthood. I believe in the field of therapy, this is what we call projection. It seems to me like Dr. Coleman thinks therapists diagnose their clients' parents because he's the one speculating on his clients' children who he's never met before. On that same page, he also promises he can help you assess the role of others in your estrangement, such as ex-spouses, sons or daughter-in-law, or other family members, because as we all know, when an adult child chooses to go no contact, it's often the case that somebody is brainwashing them into doing it because they can't think for themselves, poor dummies. Oh, and he'll also evaluate the role of your child's therapist in causing the estrangement, and he will tell you the relative importance of prior, quote mark, mistakes you've made in the relationship. Anyway, Coleman talks about how his daughter cut him off for a while, and he admits he reacted defensively, but that he needed to take responsibility for the kernel of truth in what she said. So now I guess they're reconciled and kumbaya. Moving on from Dr. Coleman, Oprah also invites on her show Dr. Gibson, the author of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, which is a wonderful book, highly recommend it. And Oprah asks her what I think is a pretty loaded and misguided question as to whether she encourages people to cut off their family members. And Dr. Gibson immediately assures her that is not the case, as any ethical therapist will assure you.
When you say to someone, or do you say to them, perhaps you should go no contact?
Yeah, I don't say that.
You don't say that.
I don't say that.
She says actually she doesn't even use clinical terms in her work with adult children. She stays away even from the term emotionally immature in her therapy work, sort of dispelling this stereotype that therapists who are helping adult children process through these issues are somehow pathologizing and diagnosing their parents and like actually advising them to cut contact with them. I'm sure there are some unethical therapists who do that, but I definitely think they're in the minority because that is a big no-no according to the entire AP ethics code. Nedra Tawwab, another therapist and the author of Drama Free, was also invited. And honestly, I didn't take a lot of notes on what she said just because she was sort of middle of the line on this discussion. I agreed with most of what she said. Next, Oprah shifts gear into talking to adult estranged children, starting off with a man who talks about his estrangement from his parents. He said he started dating his girlfriend. His family didn't like his girlfriend. Once they got engaged, his family really started escalating in their feelings and their attempts to control his life. They started triangulating, inviting his friends to lunch with them, asking about how to delay and cancel the wedding, were not happy once they got married, and then reacted really poorly to his wife getting pregnant with their first child, and that they had conversations about it, but they were not able to repair in the way that they had hoped. Oprah's questions seem a little bit leading here. She asks things like, where did you get the idea of the estrangement, and did you talk about it first? To me, sort of like hinting at like these stereotypes that when adult children choose to go no contact, it's because they saw it on the internet or because they lack conflict resolution skills and they weren't able to talk about it first. Both of which this guy dispelled were not factors for him. He also mentioned that his wife was estranged from her family because she was disowned for religious reasons. Now, after they share their story, Dr. Coleman warns the couple against modeling to their own kids to just cut your parents off during conflict.
Are presenting your children with a role model of how to handle conflict. And that's a concern. You are showing them that people can be cut out of your life. And so that is a role model. Because I'll sometimes work with a parent who will say, well, you did it, Mom. You cut out your grandma, so why can't I cut out you? So I mean, an adult child. So we just have to be very mindful of every layer of this.
I didn't really see how this was relevant because, again, the guy literally said estrangement was a last resort for them, something that they tried having discussions about first. So it wasn't like this was the first thing they tried. And Dr. Gibson actually responds with exactly what I was thinking in that moment, which is you're not modeling, hey, just cut off your parents. You're modeling that it's okay to walk away from people who have mistreated you. You as a parent should not be worried about that, right? Like if you're modeling to your kids, don't stick around when people mistreat you. Why are you worried about that? Are you going to mistreat your kids? Because that's the only situation in which you should be worried about what you're modeling.
Oh,
Yes.
I thought about that. I think you will try, knowing what you all do about the importance of your inner subjective experience as being an individual. You're going to pass that on to your child, that what people make you feel inside matters, okay? And that has to be taken into account. It's not a solution just to cut somebody out for no reason, of course. But if there are reasons, there are people that the role model that you're becoming is, if there are people that are harmful to you emotionally, you do have the right to keep as much distance, maybe not total cutoff or whatever. You have the right to decide the optimal distance that you're going to have in your relationship with them.
Then there's another adult estranged child named Bree who talks about her own estrangement. She says she always knew she was going to go no contact, even as a child. And actually, it was her own mom who blocked her for standing up for herself, and she just kind of followed suit and, cut off contact with her. For some reason, at this point, we switch back to Dr. Coleman, who cites a 2016 study to claim that what constitutes harm, abuse, trauma, and neglect have radically expanded.
There was a study done in 2016 which showed that our ideas about what constitutes harm, abuse, trauma, and neglect have radically expanded in the past 3 decades. Radically expanded.
Now, the way he phrases it, Dr. Coleman makes it sound like there was a study in 2016 showing his point. The study it seems like he's referring to is not an empirical study. It's basically an academic opinion piece on concept creep. The article says, I contend that the expansion primarily reflects an ever-increasing sensitivity to harm, reflecting a liberal moral agenda. Its implications are ambivalent, however. Although conceptual change is inevitable and often well-motivated, concept creep runs the risk of pathologizing everyday experience and encouraging a sense of virtuous and impotent victimhood. So, yeah, it was considered normal in the past to abuse and neglect your children. This article claims that emotional abuse and neglect as abuse are new expansions to the definition of abuse. It claims that emotional abuse is often subjective. I think most victims of abuse will tell you that the physical aspect of abuse that they've experienced isn't usually the worst part. Wounds close, bruises heal, but the worst part about both physical and emotional abuse is the psychological scarring that follows. The way you can no longer trust your own judgment, your own memory, your sense that the world is a safe place. Most people, I think, would rather just be punched in the face than have their self-esteem peeled apart layer by layer systematically over years. Like, I remember one time as a kid, an adult slapped me on the face, and while, I was startled in that moment, that memory is nothing to me compared to some of the emotional things that I've experienced in my life. Also, although it's true that human behavior is always experienced through a person's subjective lens, mental health professionals can still spot emotional abuse a mile away. There's a very high degree of inter-rater reliability when mental health professionals are deciding, is this emotional abuse or not? So I'm not quite sure why these two men are making it sound like it's just so hazy and impossible to determine what emotional abuse is. We actually have very standardized methods of assessing for it. For example, the psychological maltreatment inventory has items assessing for things like yelling and screaming, insulting, belittling, and name-calling, mocking and humiliating, criticizing in a devaluing way, isolating from other people, denying abusive behaviors, telling the other person that their feelings are wrong, blaming the other person, making the other person feel responsible for their emotions. Right? Like, in the field of psychology, it's very clear to us what we're talking about when we talk about emotional abuse. I do agree with Haslam's point that concept creep has diluted the meaning of words like trauma, particularly online when used by lay people who don't fully understand the words they're using rather than by professionals. But that should never be used as a reason to invalidate people who have made the extremely difficult decision to cut off literal family members, because I don't know a single person who takes something like that lightly. And also, if your child does go no contact with you because of a trend or to fit in with internet culture, I feel like you probably have made a few mistakes in parenting them anyway. So back to the estranged children, we then hear from a different Bree who decided to go no contact with her mom, and she talks about how her mom abandoned her family at 6 years old. She tried to have a relationship with her in college, and her mom ended up humiliating her at her graduation, hysterically calling an emergency in front of everyone and causing a scene when all she was trying to communicate was me and my boyfriend need to leave, actually. And Bree talks about how she hears from a lot of people you only have one mother and the effect that sort of guilting has on her. And she and the panel of experts talk about acceptance as a form of forgiveness, how forgiveness can look like simply accepting that this is the person you're dealing with. So then we move on to the estranged parents, starting with Christy, who I actually recognize from her TikToks. Oprah plays one of her TikToks TikTok videos where she calls BS that kids go no contact to protect themselves. And she goes into listing things that parents do for their kids, which is so classic.
Your children are not estranging from you to hurt you. They're doing it to protect themselves. I call BS. What are they protecting themselves from with us? Loving parents who've always supported them, loving parents who's always, done everything in their power to be there for them, who financially has supported them, who has went out of their way and put their life on the back burner for their kids. What are they protecting themselves from?
Guess what? I have flaws. What are they? Oh, I don't know. I sing in the shower. Sometimes I spend too much time volunteering. Occasionally, I'll hit somebody with my car.
I actually recognize Christy. I think I've reacted to one of her TikToks. I think a lot of her TikToks come off pretty defensive, pretty tribal, sort of creating this divide between parents and children in estrangement. She's actually made a video montage in which she shows her estranged daughter's face. People can easily find her username from her page. She shares a lot about her estrangement on her page in a way that, to me, feels like a little bit violating of her daughter's privacy. And actually, I watched a podcast episode that Codependency Kate did interviewing her estranged daughter. In that episode, her daughter flat out said, she's really uncomfortable with how publicly her mom has spoken about their estrangement. She wants nothing to do with it. She's tried to, block her, block certain words, set boundaries with people who are bringing those videos to her attention.
The elephant in the room now is that your estranged parent is posting online about the estrangement, about you, in particular, like in a way. And I say that because revealing your face, revealing your right, your username, or right, when did that start?
Right as I moved out, probably a month or so after. In terms of just tiny little Facebook things here and there. I think for me, it was just kind of just at first I was just why? Just shake my head, why are we doing this? Anger, just why? Why this is bad enough between the two of us. Why do we have to do this on the internet? Right? I don't understand. I had so many questions. It's why are we doing this? And as time went on, it started to hurt a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was at first I was mad, and then I was hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I worked through therapy, and then even as I got out of therapy, there's still some things that I would get sent from people. I get to the point I'm stop.
And that her mom would need to stop talking about it publicly if she wanted to repair the rupture between them.
I feel it's at a point where it is there's a lack of privacy now, I just said. And I said, I feel every single time a video is posted or information about this is posted, or a negative remark about me as an individual is posted, it's a whole nother week that we're going to go, right? Because I have put the time and effort to forgive and to understand why. And I have pumped so much energy into myself, into my own, mental health and well-doing and life changes. And I just want that to occur. And I want her to, heal. And I want her to forgive. And I want her to heal. And I want her to feel, acceptance of the situation.
Also, I noticed in one of her recent videos, Christy is responding to one of the comments on her video, saying she also thought it was a red flag that the wife of the first estranged adult child is also no contact with her family. And I was just kind of confused by that because, I remember seeing in the podcast that woman specifically say she was disowned by her family for religious reasons.
Because are you speaking to your parent? You're not speaking to your parents either?
No.
Why aren't you speaking to your parents?
I grew up in a very religious household. And when I became an adult and was not necessarily having some of the same morals and values and political beliefs and religion, they basically disowned me.
Okay. They disowned you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So why would Christy, who is actually there, not remember that? It just seems like it's again going on this stereotype of it must have been the new woman he married who's actually to blame for him going no contact with his family, when the wife literally said in front of our eyes that she was not the one who chose to go no contact with her family. She was disowned for religious reasons. So there's just a lot on Christy's page that I'm I don't know about this. But in the Oprah episode specifically, Christy says that it was a few estrangements and then they reconnected really well. And then finally, her daughter cut her off over something so minor.
It was something so minor.
And like, this is very vague, of course. And Oprah challenges her to be a little bit more specific about what was the one little thing. And again, Christy cannot be specific and just says she just didn't get her way.
The reason we are not talking now, it was such a little thing. We all are wondering, what little thing was that? What was that? And you know what? I was going to say, but I didn't want to interrupt you. Maybe it was a little, obviously, it was a little thing to you, but it wasn't a little thing to her.
It was something, she didn't get her way.
Okay.
She didn't get her way.
She says she asked to talk to her daughter. Her daughter also cut off other family members. If you watch the podcast episode that Codependency Kate actually did with her daughter, you will hear her daughter talking about how when they reconnected, she still didn't quite feel like she could be herself because of the way her mom had initially reacted to her coming out as lesbian as a teenager.
And it just felt like, I just couldn't be what the relationship she wanted it to be between us. Like I just couldn't offer that, right? Like it was just so hard for me. I was never being somebody that I wasn't or faking a relationship, right? But it was just like I'm scared of having that again.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of like you had internalized maybe just by nature before that you had done something wrong, or that your coming out had caused this rift between the two of you. And so you're saying when you're more of an adult, even on your own, even being yourself, even being more secure in your life, that it still felt like, oh my gosh, what if I do something wrong and get kind of abandoned again, get rejected again? Is that what you're saying? That just on an emotional level?
Yeah, just on an emotional level, just being scared of something like me saying the wrong thing or us getting into an argument or us getting into a fight, and then we're going to be estranged for a year or two again, not going to talk.
Yeah.
And then I wasn't going to have a motherly relationship with her again.
Okay.
Right.
And then basically she just started to shut down more and more, and her mom kept asking her to talk about it. And when she couldn't do it, her mom basically gave her 4 or 5 days to leave the house, kicked her out essentially.
And, we had shared some words about some things, and after that it was continuously I want to talk about this, 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 and I was just avoidant I don't want to say the wrong thing, back to I don't want to risk another blow up, I don't want to risk another estrangement, I don't want to risk another time in my life where I don't have a good relationship with this part of my family. And I was just avoidant, wanting to get out of it. And eventually that ended up in me just I wouldn't talk about it. And she made it clear you're not going to talk about it type thing, and I wasn't going to share and I wasn't going to sit down and talk about it, that I had to move out. And I was forced out. I had 4 or 5 days to get out, and I was well, I don't know what I'm going to do.
And she also said that her mom sent her a message when an uncle died, and the daughter was saying she wanted to just sit on it for 24 hours before responding. And when she did eventually respond, her message showed up green. So she thinks maybe her mom blocked her or something when she didn't immediately respond.
And I sat on it for 24 hours and then eventually responded, kind of just kept it short and sweet to the point of just hey, I hate to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. My condolences to you all and the family and anybody's life that, he touched, that's kind of kept it short, sweet. And I think my no response for 24 hours kind of deteriorated the conversation, because when I had sent a text message, it just went green. So I'm assuming I kind of got blocked, maybe just didn't respond quick enough, whatever it may have been. I don't know if the message was sent and then immediately blocked, so I got it but couldn't respond, or what the what's behind that.
So, there are definitely some inconsistencies between the way Christy is framing it and the way her daughter is framing what actually happened during the estrangement. And I also thought it was really interesting how Christy kept coming back to this idea that she knows I'm a good person. A lot of us are really good parents. We aren't deserving of this. She goes into how her boys reassure her all the time that she's not a bad mom.
I'm a mom of 3. They reassure me all the time, Mom,
you were not a bad mom.
It sounds to me like this knee-jerk defense against shame, to like want to reassure yourself that you're actually a good person, you're a good parent. And like as a parent myself, I just don't really understand this, to be honest. When I inadvertently cause my child suffering by like, sometimes it could be like blowing my nose too loudly and it'll like scare my baby. I feel awful. I feel like, oh my God, I am responsible for my child's suffering. And that's over something obviously like as unintentional and minor as like blowing your nose. I can't imagine with like something larger, with like your child actually coming to you and saying, you caused me pain and suffering when you did this. How as a parent you could be so much more preoccupied with preserving a positive self-image than with the suffering that you've caused your child. I just don't understand that. And also Christy keeps saying, I feel like my daughter lacks conflict resolution skills. And she later admits that she probably didn't teach it enough in her household. She asks the experts how to teach conflict resolution skills. On Codependency Kate's podcast, her daughter also confirms like, yeah, she does have an issue with like shutting down when things get heavy. She did feel like there were a lot of things swept under the rug growing up. And also I just keep thinking about like how she didn't feel safe growing up to come out as a lesbian. And that probably shaped her approach to conflict to quite a large degree of like when there's something important and vulnerable that's on her mind, she probably just sort of defaults to hiding away that part of herself because it feels safer. Now, Christy also talks about how so many parents don't even get the opportunity to talk about it. And you know, I don't believe that this is true in the majority of cases because people have a tendency to distort things when they're remembering them. And there are so many testimonials of estranged children saying, I told my parent in words and voicemails and writing, like in all these different ways that I even have proof of sometimes. And my parent still claims that I never communicated to them what needed to change. However, this did make me wonder if maybe the opposite could sometimes also be true, that sometimes estranged children think they've communicated to their parents, but maybe haven't done a very good job of it where they don't even realize it. Also, I think, listen, like in a minority of cases, I do think sometimes adult children go no contact with their parents without warning and without explanation. For example, I came across this TikTok video soon after watching Oprah's podcast.
I blocked my mother on everything without conversation or warning the other day. Like literally every way that she could possibly contact me, blocked on all of them. I didn't warn her, didn't tell her, didn't let her know like, hey, this is what's happening, because I don't care. I don't care to let her know, right? Because like I spent a whole lifetime being hurt by this woman. And there comes a transition period sometimes for some of us, for the unfortunate few, where you go from thinking your parents just kind of a little messed up and like need some help to, oh, this is not a safe person. This is not a good person for me to be around. I realize that like if I ever have children, I do not want my children around this woman. If I ever have a partner, I don't want them to meet this person. Like, I don't want them in my life at all. I don't want them part of my future, part of my life. Like when I think about a peaceful life, they are not in it. And so I thought, why do I have them? Literally, why? Like to keep the peace? Whose peace am I keeping? Hers, not mine.
So I don't know how you feel about the TikTok I just showed, but like for me personally, do I think it's the best course of action to just cut off a parent without explanation? No, I think generally speaking, it's a good idea to explain it to them first. But there are definitely many situations where that is the safer approach, where like if you are aware that like, hey, this person is violent, this person has never shown the capacity for self-reflection or change, this person has time after time responded in extremely harmful ways when I've tried to bring issues to them, I don't think it's a hate crime to just cut them off without an explanation, if that's the case. If you as a person do not come across as someone that can be reasoned with, then you can't expect people to reason with you before cutting you off. So I think there's just like no blanket statement that applies to this topic. It's not like, well, kids always discuss this with their parents and always give an explanation, or kids never give an explanation to their parents. It's probably like a variety of situations. In a lot of situations, these kids did try to communicate to their parents in one way or another. Some of them went on to give one last explanation before cutting them off. Some of them did not. Some of them never felt safe. Some kids probably could have done a better job communicating themselves. Some adults are completely misremembering and distorting the fact that their kids did communicate to them. There's a variety of situations, but I think at the end of the day, we need to remember that it takes a lot for a child to completely cut off their parent. That is not something that anyone I know takes lightly. Then we hear from Kendall, who is estranged from her son by choice. And she expresses that she's kind of wounded by how people in the crowd are nodding along, agreeing with the estranged children, but not so much when Christy's telling her story.
Yes, I am estranged from my 30-year-old son by choice. And what I do notice, even in the room, when the children were speaking, people were kind of nodding and agreeing with them. But the moment Christy started telling her side of the story, people were kind of like, you know what I'm saying? My platform speaks similar to hers on behalf of the parent, because parents are suffering in silence. And when children become estranged, they are celebrated, they're supported, people rally behind them. But when their mother decides to go no contact with her child, she's demonized. And that's been my experience.
First of all, I think, that might have to do more with Christy's specific situation rather than Christy being sort of like a representative of all estranged parents. But yeah, I definitely see how people might be harsher on parents who decide to go no contact than on kids. And I suspect that Kendall has received a lot of judgment for her own choice and has a lot of shame regarding that, and is probably hypervigilant to signs that she's being judged by other people. People tend to be harsher on parents who go no contact with their kids because they sort of expect unconditional love from a parent, which, to be clear, I don't agree with that. I think no one needs to accept abuse. If your child is being abusive to you, then you are well within your right to estrange yourself. Another reason is that, again, there's this power imbalance between parents and children. So sometimes it can kind of look like, I guess, punching down for a parent to sever ties with their child. And also I think because people expect parents to take responsibility for what went wrong in the dynamic. And so if a parent is cutting off a child and saying you are a problem child, in a lot of situations people are like, okay, but how did you contribute to your child turning out that way? So Kendall shares how she has experienced all kinds of abuse from her son, and that he continues to threaten her and her husband. Her situation seems very severe. And again, I do not fault her for deciding to cut contact with her son, not in the slightest. What I do wonder about is, again, how her son turned out that way, because I do not believe children are born violent. I'm certainly not suggesting necessarily Kendall was violent to him. It's possible that, there was, a different parent that was violent. He got in with the wrong crowd at school, or maybe he experienced some sort of trauma outside the home. So it is not necessarily the parent's fault that a child turned out that way, but it is usually the parent's responsibility, because even when things happen outside the home, the parent is the one that kind of has to navigate that at home with the child. So while I personally don't see it as wrong that Kendall chose to cut ties with her child, I personally would, in her situation, probably want to take some sort of responsibility for the way my child turned out, even in a situation like that. My husband and I have sometimes shared with each other, if our child, wanted to estrange themselves or developed a personality disorder or whatever it may be, we would always wonder, even if we thought we were the loveliest parents, we would always want to be how did we contribute to this situation? Because you as the parent have a certain degree of power until hopefully the power sort of evens out. And then we hear from Aaron, who was estranged, then reconciled with one of his kids. He talks about how he thought he was a great dad, but later his daughter told him he was a helicopter parent and that he didn't listen to her. And he admits that, upon self-reflection, she was right. She ended up needing help enrolling for college, and he answered. And that's when she asked him to go to therapy together, and they did, and they both learned things that they could do better. So Aaron is an example of, a parent who was able to self-reflect, took accountability, and in the end reconciled with his daughter. Dr. Gibson also points out that self-reflection is what helped Aaron turn his situation around, and she also points out that sometimes people are perceived as intimidating to do conflict resolution with, because again, that power imbalance between parent and child is relevant here. Sometimes children just don't feel safe to speak up. Now, at this point, Oprah reveals that she recently had a friend who received a letter of no contact from her child, who thought everything was great between the two of them. They went bowling, had a good time, and then suddenly this letter comes in the mail.
I think this is so interesting. I have a friend who just went through is going through this with her daughter, and she said, we'd gone out for Thai food and bowling.
Correct.
I thought everything was fantastic, and then I get a letter arrives in the mail telling me from this day forward, no contact. And she thought something had happened to her daughter. She thought it was that her daughter had been kidnapped.
Which kind of makes sense now why Oprah might have wanted to do this episode. And Oprah says, it's great that we are learning to protect our mental health, but have we gone too far? And an interesting discussion arises again between her and the experts on the panel. Oprah has a good point that when you raise your kids to just obey, they don't know how to talk to their parent when an issue comes up. If you just teach your kids because I said so, Of course they're not going to know how to bring up an issue with you. Then we hear from Nurse Hadley, who is a hospice nurse. Oprah plays her TikTok in which basically she says she doesn't judge people who don't want to reconcile with their dying parent. She says from her experience, usually when parents want her to reach out to their adult children on behalf of them, it's because they want to guilt trip their child rather than actually wanting to apologize. And this was fascinating to hear. Fascinating and so sad to hear that for a lot of these parents, their dying wish is to manipulate their children. She said there was one person who seemed like they had a lot of regret and wanted to make amends. Their child didn't want to speak to them. And she was like, hey, if you want to write a letter, I can maybe try to forward it to your child. And that in the end, this person decided not to do it. Nurse Hadley talks about often how it's a form of control from the parents. One last hurrah, one last chance to exert power and control over their child. And I think it really just goes to show some people will never be able to self-reflect, not even on their deathbed. So the podcast closes with a word from the experts. Dr. Gibson says, listen, the ship has sailed regarding people caring about their inner experiences. It's no longer just about being respected for the role of being a parent. Now it's about actually having relationship skills if you want to maintain a relationship with your kids. Dr. Coleman gives us his take that too much is expected of parents these days. Whatever. My thoughts on the episode overall, I thought it was irresponsible to frame this as a trend when it is often a very difficult position and a last resort for people. I think it's irresponsible to try to be neutral or play both sides when it comes to a topic where there are a lot of allegations of abuse, and to ask negative leading questions to people who have been mistreated by those supposed to uplift them. And I understand why a lot of people are now vowing to go no contact with Oprah. She built her platform in large part on awareness of abuse, trauma, mental health, focusing on self-empowerment, uplifting the underserved. So people are feeling a little bit betrayed that this neutrality is coming from her specifically, because I guess they wouldn't expect it from her. Because if someone who looks so warm and compassionate can look you in the face and clearly have some questions as to whether they believe your side of the story, it's a lot more damaging than someone like, say, Dr. Coleman, who's built his entire platform off of raising doubts about the validity of the adult children. It comes off a little bit as like, well, my trauma was real, but kids these days are exaggerating about their trauma. But at the end of the day, Oprah was never a mental health expert. She was just a highly charismatic person who opened up about her own trauma history and focused her brand on doing good. Making this episode, though, was a business decision for her because it's a very polarizing topic. You don't need to have your decision to go no contact with your parents validated by Oprah. Let me know what you thought about the podcast episode down below, and I'll see you soon.